The morning Rachel showed up at my front door, she wasn't carrying a purse or a grocery bag like someone stopping by for coffee. She was dragging 2 full-size suitcases across my front porch like she had just stepped off a long trip with no return ticket. One suitcase bumped hard against the wooden step, making a dull thud that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet of that early hour. "I just need a place for 3 nights," she said before I even had time to say hello. 3 nights. That was the first lie, though I didn't know it yet. She stood there in the pale morning light, her hair tied back too neatly for someone supposedly in crisis. A thick tote bag hung from her shoulder, stuffed with folders and envelopes that bent awkwardly against the fabric. Under her arm, she held a rolled-up blanket, like someone preparing to settle in somewhere unfamiliar. Before I could even form a reply, I heard Daniel's voice behind me. "I already told her she could stay," he said, stepping into the doorway like the decision had been made long before I had any chance to be part of it. That moment, those 2 heavy suitcases sitting on my porch, my husband speaking for both of us without looking me in the eye, was the first crack in the peace I had spent years building. I didn't know it yet, but letting her cross that doorway would turn my home into something I barely recognized. I had lived in that house in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, for more than 30 years, long enough to know every creak in the floorboards and every place sunlight hit the walls in the late afternoon, long enough to build something stable with my own 2 hands. My flower shop sat just off the kitchen, a converted sunroom filled with vases, ribbons, and the soft scent of roses that clung to everything I owned. That house wasn't just a place to sleep. It was proof of every early morning I opened the shop before sunrise, every late night spent balancing receipts at the kitchen table, every holiday I worked while other people rested. I had finally paid off the last of my business loans, not long before Rachel appeared at my door. For the first time in decades, I had felt something close to relief. Peace, I thought, was something you earned. Rachel didn't wait for me to invite her in. She rolled her suitcase past me the moment Daniel stepped aside, her wheels clicking loudly against the hardwood floors. She looked around the living room slowly, her eyes sweeping over the furniture, the framed photos, the small table where I kept fresh flowers every morning. It wasn't the look of someone grateful. It was the look of someone measuring space. I felt something tighten in my chest, though I couldn't name it yet. Daniel shut the door behind her like everything was perfectly normal, like it was ordinary for someone to arrive unannounced with enough luggage to last a month. "She just needs a few nights," he said, his voice softer now, almost rehearsed. Rachel turned toward me with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just until I figure things out," she added. I nodded slowly, though something deep inside me felt unsettled. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet warning, like the faint sound of thunder before a storm you couldn't yet see. By mid-morning, Rachel had unpacked more than I expected. She moved through the house with surprising confidence, opening cabinets without asking, stacking her belongings neatly along the coffee table and the side of the couch. She placed her blanket across the armrest like it belonged there, smoothing it carefully with both hands. Temporary guests didn't unpack like that. Temporary guests didn't spread themselves across a room. At one point, she carried her tote bag into the kitchen and set it down on the table. The top gaped open just enough for me to glimpse the corners of several thick envelopes inside. Some were stamped with bold lettering I didn't fully read before she pulled the bag closer to her side. She noticed me looking. Her hand moved quickly, sliding the tote under her arm again. "Just paperwork," she said lightly. I nodded, but the words settled wrong in my stomach. That first afternoon stretched longer than it should have. Rachel moved from room to room, settling into the rhythm of the house like she had been there before. Daniel followed her around with an odd, nervous energy, offering coffee, snacks, reassurance. He smiled more than usual, laughed too quickly, as if trying to smooth tension that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Later that evening, as I stood at the sink rinsing dishes, I felt her presence behind me. "Would it be okay if I had my mail sent here?" Rachel asked. The question came out casually, like it was no more important than asking for a glass of water. Before I could respond, Daniel answered for me. "Of course," he said without hesitation. I turned to look at him, expecting at least a glance. Some acknowledgement that this was our house, not just his to offer. But he didn't meet my eyes. Rachel smiled again, softer this time, like she had just secured something important. "Just temporarily," she added. Temporary? That word floated through the room like smoke. Dinner that night felt heavier than usual. Rachel spoke often, filling the silence with stories about bad luck, missed opportunities, and people who had let her down. Daniel listened carefully, nodding at every turn, while I sat across from them feeling like an outsider in my own dining room. Between bites, Rachel asked small questions that didn't sound small at all. "What's the Wi-Fi password? When does the trash pickup come? Do you get deliveries often?" Each question seemed harmless on its own, but together, they sounded like someone studying the rhythm of a house they planned to stay in. Late that night, after the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, I walked quietly past the living room on my way to bed. The house felt too quiet, too still. Rachel sat alone on the couch, her laptop glowing against the darkness. She didn't hear me at first. On the screen, I caught a glimpse of a form before she snapped the laptop closed. A heading flashed in my memory for just a second. Change of address. She turned quickly when she realized I was there. "Oh," she said, forcing a small laugh. "Just taking care of paperwork." Her smile lingered a little too long. I nodded, but something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. As I walked back to my bedroom that night, the sound of my footsteps felt louder than usual against the floor. I closed the door gently behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared into the darkness for a long time. And as sleep refused to come, one thought kept circling in my mind like a warning I wasn't ready to hear. Those 3 promised nights already felt like they were turning into something much longer. The first 3 nights passed slower than I expected, like time itself had grown heavier inside my own house. Night 1 felt awkward, but manageable. Rachel stayed mostly quiet, keeping to herself while Daniel hovered nearby like he was afraid she might disappear if he left the room. I told myself it was temporary. 3 nights wasn't long enough to disrupt a life built over decades. I had hosted guests before. I knew how to be generous. Night 2 felt longer. Rachel had already spread her belongings across the living room, her blanket draped permanently over the couch, her tote bag resting near the coffee table like it belonged there. Daniel stayed up late talking with her, their voices low but constant, drifting through the hallway while I tried to sleep. Night 3 was the one that unsettled me the most. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did. No packing, no discussion about leaving, no mention of what came next. Just silence, and the quiet understanding that morning would come without any sign of departure. On the 4th morning, I walked to the mailbox the way I always did, expecting the usual mix of store catalogs and supplier notices for my flower shop. The early air carried the scent of damp grass, and for a moment, I let myself pretend everything was still normal, until I opened the mailbox. Inside sat a single envelope, thicker than the rest of my usual mail. The words certified mail were stamped boldly across the front. Rachel's name, my address. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, feeling a strange weight settle into my chest. Certified mail wasn't something people ignored. It wasn't something casual. When I walked back inside, Rachel sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee like she had lived there for years. "This came for you," I said, placing the envelope in front of her. She didn't open it. Not immediately. Instead, she stared at it for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge, as if touching it might burn her. Then, without a word, she slid it into her tote bag. Not opened. Not discussed. Hidden. People didn't hide normal mail. By the end of the first week, I noticed something else that unsettled me even more. Rachel wasn't living like a guest. She was settling. The bathroom shelf filled with full-size shampoo bottles instead of travel containers. New towels appeared on the rack, ones I didn't recognize. She rearranged the spice cabinet one afternoon, explaining casually that it made more sense this way, as if my kitchen had always needed correcting. Temporary guests didn't reorganize kitchens. Temporary guests didn't buy permanent supplies. They prepared to leave. Rachel prepared to stay. Each morning brought more mail. Not just one envelope, but several, different sizes, different return addresses. Some stamped with bold red lettering that caught my attention before I even realized what I was reading. One morning, the mailbox overflowed. I carried the stack inside, sorting automatically, mine, Daniel's, store-related, until I realized every single envelope bore Rachel's name. All of them. One envelope stood out more than the others. Thick paper, red lettering across the front. Final notice. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The warning sat there in plain sight, loud enough without explanation. I placed the pile on the kitchen counter and stepped back slowly, as if distance alone could soften what I already sensed growing inside my home. The second week brought a different kind of noise. Phone calls. At first, I didn't think much of it. The house phone rang occasionally, like it always had. But then it rang again, and again, always asking for Rachel. Is Rachel available? The voices were calm, professional, not friendly, not familiar, not the voices of friends checking in or relatives catching up. Rachel avoided those calls whenever possible. If she answered, her voice dropped to a whisper before she ended the conversation quickly. Just paperwork stuff, she told me once when I asked. But her smile felt thin, stretched too tight across something fragile. One evening, I walked into the living room and found the door closed. That had never happened before. Not in all the years I had lived there. I reached for the handle and paused, listening. Soft typing sounds leaked through the wood. Papers rustled. A chair shifted. Guests didn't close living room doors. Guests didn't claim shared spaces like private offices. Something about that closed door made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't ignore. By the 15th day, the shift in the house felt impossible to deny. Rachel moved through each room with growing confidence. She washed clothes late into the night, ran the dishwasher twice as often, left lights burning long after midnight. The hum of electricity seemed louder somehow, like the house itself knew it was being pushed beyond its limits. One afternoon, I answered the phone without thinking. Hello. A man's voice answered immediately. Is this Rachel Lawson's legal residence? The words struck harder than I expected. Legal residence. Not temporary stay. Not guest. Residence. Yes, I said slowly. She's staying here. Thank you for confirming, he replied before hanging up. That was it. No explanation. No clarification. Just confirmation. I stood there holding the receiver, listening to the empty line, feeling something cold creep into my chest. That night, I pulled out the calendar hanging near the kitchen door. One by one, I counted the crossed-out days. Day 1, Day 2, Day 10, Day 20, Day 35. 35 days. Not 3 nights, not 1 week. 35 full days inside my home. She's been here 35 days, I said quietly to Daniel later that evening. He didn't look up from the television. She just needs time, he replied, as if that settled everything. Time. Time had become the excuse for everything. Time to stay. Time to wait. Time to ignore what was unfolding right in front of us. The next afternoon, I walked to the mailbox again, my steps slower than usual, my hands colder despite the warmth of the day. Inside sat another envelope, thicker than the rest, heavier. The words, "Final legal notice," stretched across the front in dark. Unforgiving letters. Rachel Lawson. My address. But it was the smaller line beneath the bold lettering that made my breath catch. Failure to respond may result in court action. Court action. Not warning. Not suggestion. Action. I stood on the front porch longer than I meant to, the paper trembling slightly in my hands as the weight of those words settled into something real. And as I stared down at that envelope, feeling the quiet neighborhood around me continue as if nothing had changed. One thought pushed itself to the front of my mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about letting someone stay anymore. This was about something that could follow my name long after she left. The morning after I found that final legal notice, I didn't open the flower shop right away like I usually did. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope resting in front of me, staring at it as if it might move on its own. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just ink and warnings. Outside, the early light filtered through the window, touching the edge of the table, but it did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. Rachel was still asleep. Daniel stood near the sink, pouring himself coffee like nothing had changed. Did Rachel ever mention debts? I asked quietly. Daniel didn't look surprised. He didn't even hesitate. No, he said, stirring sugar into his mug. She just had some bad luck lately. Bad luck. That phrase had been used so many times over the years that it had started to sound like an excuse instead of an explanation. I slid the envelope closer to myself and finally opened it. Inside were several printed pages. Not just one. Lines of numbers. Payment demands. Deadlines printed in bold letters. My eyes scanned quickly until they landed on the part that made my breath slow. Failure to respond may result in legal escalation at this address. Not her name. Not her problem. This address. My house. I folded the pages carefully and set them back on the table, pressing my palm against the paper like I could flatten the fear growing underneath it. Around noon, the phone rang. Rachel was in the shower. Daniel had stepped outside to take a call from one of his co-workers. That left me alone in the kitchen with the sound of the ringing echoing off the walls. I picked it up before thinking, "Hello?" A man's voice answered. Calm and steady. "This is a debt resolution office calling for Rachel Lawson." My fingers tightened around the receiver. "She's not available right now," I said. There was a short pause on the other end. "Can you confirm that this is her primary residence?" the man asked. Primary residence. The words landed harder than anything printed on paper. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "She's staying here," I said slowly. Another pause. Then his voice returned, just as calm as before. "Thank you. This address is now on file." Click. The line went dead. I stood there with the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing but the hollow hum of silence. My stomach twisted in a way that made it hard to breathe. Behind me, the bathroom door opened. Rachel stepped into the hallway, towel wrapped tightly around her shoulders, water still dripping from the ends of her hair. "Who was on the phone?" she asked. Her voice sounded casual, but her eyes searched my face too quickly. "A man asking for you," I replied, "from some debt office." For a fraction of a second, her expression changed. Not anger, not confusion. Fear. Real fear. It flashed across her face so fast someone else might have missed it. "But I didn't—" "What did you tell them?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharper. "I told them you were staying here," I said. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't answer calls meant for me," she said. The words came out too fast. Too defensive. I stared at her, surprised more by her reaction than the call itself. "You're using my address," I said quietly. "That's temporary," she shot back. "It's just paperwork." Her tone didn't match her words. There was tension behind every syllable, like she was holding something back. Before I could respond, Daniel walked through the front door. "What's going on?" he asked. Rachel answered before I could speak. "She answered one of my calls," Rachel said, her voice tight with irritation. Daniel looked at me, then at her. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," he said, sighing as if the problem were nothing more than a misunderstanding. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Later that evening, I passed through the living room and noticed the door was closed again. That same closed door that had started to feel like a warning sign. Soft voices drifted from inside. Rachel's voice. Low. "Quick. Urgent. No. They can't send anything else here yet. Yet. That word stuck in my mind long after the rest of the sentence faded. Not anymore. Not never. Yet. Meaning more was coming. Meaning this wasn't over. The next day, I began paying closer attention to things I once ignored. Each morning, I walked to the mailbox with a strange mix of dread and determination. The envelopes piled up faster now, some thin, some thick, some stamped with unfamiliar company logos that meant nothing to me but clearly meant something to Rachel. I didn't open them, but I studied them, memorized them, noticed patterns. Different companies, different return addresses, same name, same house. One afternoon, I saw Rachel standing near the kitchen counter, holding one of those envelopes. She tore it open quickly, scanning the contents with growing tension in her face. Her skin went pale. Her hand trembled slightly before she folded the paper and shoved it into her tote bag. Not the trash. Not the counter. Hidden. As she walked past me, something slipped from her hand and floated to the floor unnoticed. I bent down to pick it up. Just a small piece of paper, torn from something larger. But the words printed across it made my chest tighten. Balance transferred to new account. New account. New risk. New trouble. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the growing pile of envelopes stacked neatly near the edge. My eyes moved from the papers to the calendar on the wall, counting days again without meaning to. Every piece of mail, every phone call, every quiet conversation behind closed doors. They all connected somehow. Rachel hadn't just come here for shelter. She needed something more. She needed stability. An address. A place that looked safe enough to attach her problems to. And my house had become that place. Daniel walked into the room while I was still sitting there, lost in my thoughts. "This isn't about kindness anymore," I said quietly. He stopped in the doorway. "You're overthinking this," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when he didn't want to argue. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he didn't. But I knew something had already changed. Early the next morning, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. Not once. Twice. Firm. Deliberate. Rachel froze in the hallway when she heard it. She moved toward the window slowly, peeking through the curtain. The color drained from her face. "Don't open that," she whispered. Her voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. But I was already walking toward the door. My hand rested on the knob. My heart pounded louder than the bell itself. Slowly, I turned the handle and pulled the door open. A man stood on the porch, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt, a clipboard tucked under his arm. His expression was polite, but distant, professional. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I'm here regarding Rachel Lawson's outstanding balance tied to this property." And standing there in my own doorway, staring at a stranger who knew my address, my home, and my connection to debts I had never made, I realized something I could no longer ignore. This wasn't just her problem anymore. It had become mine. The man at my door didn't rush his words, and that made everything feel worse. He stood there with one hand resting on his clipboard, his posture straight, professional, like he had delivered news like this 100 times before. His eyes moved past me for just a second, scanning the inside of my house without stepping forward. "Ma'am," he repeated calmly, "we've been trying to reach Rachel Lawson regarding unresolved balances." My fingers tightened against the edge of the door. "She's staying here temporarily," I said, forcing the words out as steadily as I could. He nodded once, as if he had heard that explanation many times before. "Understood," he replied. "However, this property has been listed as her official mailing residence." Official. That word didn't just land, it settled deep, like something heavy dropping into water. "If there's no response soon," he continued, "further legal steps may follow at this address. At this address, not hers. Mean." Behind me, I felt movement. Rachel had stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent against the floor. I didn't have to turn around to know she was there. I could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from an open oven. I told them not to come here, she whispered sharply. Not surprised. Not confused. Not asking why. Told them not to come here. The man nodded politely once more, handed me a small printed notice, and stepped backward down the porch steps. Have a good day, ma'am, he said. Then he walked away as if nothing unusual had happened, leaving me standing in my own doorway with a piece of paper that felt heavier than the door itself. When I closed the door, the silence inside the house felt thick and suffocating. Rachel turned on me immediately. You didn't have to open the door, she snapped. Her voice carried more anger than fear now. It's my house, I replied, still holding the notice tightly in my hand. You made it worse, she shot back. Worse? As if I had created the problem. As if answering my own door had been the mistake. Before I could respond, the front door opened again. Daniel walked in, setting his keys on the table, glancing between us with confusion. What's going on? He asked. Rachel answered before I could speak. They showed up, she said quickly, because she answered calls and opened the door. The blame came so naturally it barely sounded like blame at all. Daniel sighed, rubbing his forehead. This is getting blown out of proportion, he muttered. Those words hit harder than I expected. Blown out of proportion. Like the man standing on our porch had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Rachel crossed her arms tightly. If they take this further, she said slowly, it affects everyone here. Everyone? Not me. Everyone. There was something sharp hidden inside that sentence. Something that sounded less like worry and more like warning. The argument ended without resolution. But something inside the house had changed. Over the next few days, small things began shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. Rachel started rearranging the kitchen. At first, it was subtle. A spice jar moved from one shelf to another. A stack of plates shifted to a different cabinet. I noticed it while preparing lunch one afternoon, reaching automatically for something that wasn't where it had always been. I moved things to make it easier, Rachel said casually when she noticed me searching. She didn't ask. She didn't apologize. She just explained, like she had every right to change my space. Later that same day, I came home from the flower shop and stopped in the doorway of the living room. My favorite vase, the one I had kept in the same spot for years, was gone. I found it later on a side table near the window, placed beside Rachel's stack of papers. Like decoration. Like background. Like my belongings had become part of her world. The feeling that settled over me wasn't anger. It was displacement. Like walking into someone else's home by mistake. The next morning, I noticed something taped to the refrigerator. A small square of paper. Mail, leave for Rachel. Not a request. Not a question. An instruction. I stared at it longer than I should have, reading those words over and over again. That refrigerator had been mine for decades. Every note on it had once belonged to my life. Delivery reminders. Flower orders. Birthdays. Small messages from customers. Now there was an order sitting in the center of it, written in Rachel's handwriting. That afternoon, I walked to the mailbox again, dread building with every step. Inside sat another envelope, different from the others. Official looking. Formal? The return address read County Legal Office. Rachel Lawson. My address. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a neatly printed notice. Notice of pending legal review. Pending. Not threatened. Not warned. Already moving. Already happening. A line near the bottom caught my attention, pulling the air straight from my lungs. If unresolved, legal presence may be required at this address. Legal presence. At this address. My house. Not hers. Mine. That night, dinner passed in strained silence. Rachel sat across from me, typing constantly on her laptop. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate, speaking only when necessary, as if silence might protect him from choosing sides. After dinner, I walked into the kitchen and pulled the latest utility estimate from the counter. Electric usage higher than usual, Water usage climbing steadily. Internet data nearly doubled. Numbers didn't lie. Consequences didn't stay hidden. Rachel hadn't just brought stress into my house. She had brought cost, strain, risk. Late that night, long after the lights were turned off, I passed through the living room again. A single lamp glowed near the couch. On the coffee table sat an open envelope. Not sealed. Not hidden. Inside, I saw bold lettering across the top of a document. Summons preparation notice. Preparation. Not yet official. But close. Close enough to feel like thunder rolling in the distance. Rachel stepped into the room suddenly, catching me staring at the paper. "You shouldn't touch things that aren't yours," she said coldly. Her words hit harder than they should have. Not because they were cruel, because they sounded confident. Possessive. Like ownership had shifted without permission. I looked around the room slowly, taking in every detail, the furniture I had chosen, the floors I had cleaned, the walls I had painted over years of careful work, and standing there in my own living room, holding a piece of paper that threatened my peace, my finances, and my name, I realized something I had been too afraid to admit. My home was no longer just my sanctuary. It had become part of her escape plan. The envelope lay on the coffee table long after Rachel walked out of the room, and for the first time since she arrived, she had forgotten to hide something. Not sealed, not tucked away. Just sitting there like it belonged. I stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at it while the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than usual. The rest of the house had fallen quiet. Daniel had gone outside to take a call, and Rachel's footsteps faded down the hallway toward the guest room. The paper didn't move, but it felt like it was calling to me. For weeks, I had watched from a distance. I had stayed polite, careful, quiet. I had told myself that patience was kindness, that waiting would keep peace in the house. But something inside me shifted in that moment. Not panic, not anger. Something closer to decision. I stepped forward slowly and picked up the envelope. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were several pages. Not just one. Thick. Printed statements filled with account numbers, due dates, and warnings printed in bold lettering. I flipped through them carefully, scanning line after line until one detail forced my breath to slow. My address? Printed again, and again, and again. Not once. Not twice. Multiple times across different pages. Different companies. Different balances. Different deadlines. But always the same location. My home. I spread the papers across the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle. One statement showed a credit account. Another listed unpaid service fees. A third referenced balance transfers already in progress. This wasn't a single mistake. It wasn't one overdue bill. It was a pattern. A system. And I had been standing in the middle of it without seeing the full picture. One line caught my eye near the center of a page. Primary residence confirmed. Confirmed. Not temporary. Not guest. Residence. The word settled deep inside my chest, pressing against my lungs until breathing felt heavier than before. That was the moment fear turned into something else. Not panic. Anger. Quiet anger. The kind that didn't shout but stayed still. Watching. Learning. Remembering. As I turned another page, one of the company names felt familiar in a way I couldn't ignore. My mind pulled backward through memory until it landed on a moment I had almost forgotten. Several years earlier, late at night, Daniel standing in the kitchen with his phone pressed tightly to his ear, his voice low. Urgent. Rachel had called him crying. She had lost her job. Her landlord had given her notice. She had nowhere to go. I remembered standing at the doorway back then, listening while Daniel promised help without asking me first. He had transferred money quietly the next morning, telling me afterward like it had already been decided. She just needs one more chance, he had said. One more chance. Those words echoed now in my mind like a warning I should have taken more seriously. Back then, Rachel had promised to change, promised to find stable work, promised to rebuild her life. But promises were easy. Responsibility was harder. And history, I realized, had a way of repeating itself when people refused to learn from it. I shook the memory away and returned to the present. Staring down at the papers still spread across the table. Same pattern. Different house. Different address. Same chaos. That was when I noticed something that made my hands tighten around the edge of the page. A separate form sat near the bottom of the stack. Address verification form. Signed. Rachel's signature curved across the line in dark ink. The date printed beside it was recent. Very recent. Not from months ago. Not from years ago. From days after she moved into my house. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't panic. This was planning. Rachel hadn't just needed shelter. She needed a stable address. A location that looked permanent enough to attach her problems to someone else's property. Someone else's name behind the walls. And without realizing it, I had handed her exactly what she needed. I turned another page and froze. Balance transferred to new registered address. My address. Again. The words blurred for a moment as a cold wave moved through my chest. Not temporary damage. Expanding damage. Spreading damage. The kind that grew quietly until it reached places you couldn't undo. Footsteps sounded behind me. Daniel entered the room and stopped abruptly when he saw the papers spread across the table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Did you know?" I asked finally. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the documents, his face tightening as recognition settled in. "She didn't have anywhere else to go," he said at last. Not denial. Not confusion. Defense. The words hit harder than anything printed on those pages. Not just betrayal from Rachel. Betrayal from him. Because he had chosen comfort over truth. Again. "We can fix this," Daniel added quickly, stepping closer. "We..." That word struck deeper than anything else. Not she. Not Rachel. We. Meaning me. Meaning my responsibility. Meaning my burden. That was when something inside me stopped resisting reality. Later that night, after the house fell silent, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the stack of papers in front of me. The overhead light cast long shadows across the wood, turning every document into something heavier than paper. Kindness had turned into liability. Trust had turned into exposure. Silence had turned into danger. I reached for my phone and began taking photographs of each document. One by one. Slowly. Carefully. Making sure every detail remained clear. Not reacting. Preparing. I gathered the pages together and slid them into a folder, smoothing the edges so they sat neatly inside. No panic. No rushing. Just organization. Control. That was the word that stayed with me as I closed the folder and turned off the kitchen light. Standing there in the darkness, holding that folder against my chest, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. This was no longer about helping family. This was about protecting myself. The morning everything changed didn't start with shouting or slammed doors. It started with a piece of paper. I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into my favorite mug, when Rachel walked in with a calm expression that didn't match the tension that had been growing in the house for weeks. She didn't look tired. She didn't look worried. She looked prepared. Without greeting me, she placed a sheet of paper flat on the kitchen table. "I need help covering these," she said. Not asking. Not explaining. Just stating it like it was already decided. I set the coffee pot down slowly and stepped closer. The paper was filled with numbers, phone charges, subscription fees, late payment penalties, lines of overdue amounts stacked one beneath another, each one representing something I had never agreed to carry. "This isn't mine," I said quietly. Rachel crossed her arms and leaned back against the counter, completely at ease. "You're financially stable," she replied. "This shouldn't be a big deal for you." There was no apology in her voice. No embarrassment. No shame. Just expectation. Something inside my chest tightened. Not from fear this time, but from the weight of understanding exactly what she was doing. You're asking me to pay your bills, I said. She shrugged slightly. You own this house. You run a business. You can afford it. The words were spoken casually, like she was listing facts, not making demands. Then her tone shifted just enough to make my stomach twist. If collectors come here again, she added, it affects you too. There it was. Not a request. A warning dressed as logic. This wasn't about help anymore. This was pressure. Before I could respond, the front door opened. Daniel walked in, loosening his tie as he stepped into the kitchen. His eyes moved from Rachel to the paper on the table, then finally to me. Rachel spoke first. She's upset about helping, she said softly. Helping. That word made the situation sound smaller than it really was. She wants me to pay her bills, I corrected. Daniel paused, staring at the paper for a long moment. His shoulders lifted slightly as he exhaled, the way he always did when something uncomfortable entered the room. Well, he began slowly, maybe we can help a little. Not she. Not Rachel. The word landed harder than anything Rachel had said. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at him, waiting for him to realize what he had just agreed to. She's family, he added quietly. The same words. Again, like they had never caused damage before. I straightened my posture, forcing my voice to stay calm. I didn't sign up to carry her debts. I said. Rachel stepped forward, her expression sharpening. You're exaggerating, she replied quickly. Gaslighting. The word floated through my mind, though I didn't say it aloud. She slid the paper closer to me across the table, pushing it until the edge nearly touched my hand. You're making this bigger than it is, she continued. Daniel stepped closer too, but not beside me. Beside her. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. They stood shoulder to shoulder while I faced them alone. If this goes to court, Rachel said, lowering her voice. Your address is already listed. The words filled the room like smoke. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy, threatening. I felt the loneliness settle into my chest then. Not sudden, but steady. Like a slow realization that the people I expected to stand with me had quietly moved to the other side. This isn't about money anymore, I said, barely above a whisper. Rachel tilted her head slightly, watching me like she was waiting for me to surrender. You wouldn't want legal trouble attached to your property, would you? She asked. Her tone remained calm, soft, almost gentle, but more dangerous than shouting. I looked from Rachel to Daniel, searching his face for hesitation, doubt, anything that suggested he understood what was happening. Instead, I saw exhaustion, avoidance, fear of conflict, not protection, not support. That realization hurt more than anything else. Later that evening, after Rachel retreated to the living room and the television filled the house with noise that no one truly watched, I sat beside Daniel on the couch. Do you really think this is my responsibility? I asked. He kept his eyes on the screen. She has nowhere else to go, he replied, not answering my question. Redirecting it, avoiding it. Like shifting responsibility was easier than facing the truth. I watched the light from the television flicker across his face, wondering how many times he had convinced himself that helping meant sacrificing someone else's peace. That night, after everyone else went to bed, I returned to the kitchen alone. The house felt different now, not just tense, divided. I placed Rachel's bill on the table again and stared at it under the overhead light. Numbers stared back at me like accusations. Not mine. Never mine. But somehow already touching my life. For weeks, I had reacted quietly, watched carefully, gathered information piece by piece. But this moment felt different. This moment demanded preparation. I walked to the cabinet where I had hidden my folder and pulled it out slowly. The papers inside had grown thicker with every passing day, copies of envelopes, notes from phone calls, photographs of documents, evidence, proof. Control? I placed Rachel's bill on top of the stack and smoothed it flat with my hand. Then I added it to the folder. Filed it carefully. Not in anger. Not in fear. In preparation. And as I closed the folder and held it firmly against the table, a new understanding settled into my chest, heavy, but steady. If they were going to turn my home into their shield, then I was going to turn their actions into my proof. Rachel announced the dinner like it was a celebration, not a confrontation. We should all sit down and talk like family, she said one afternoon, standing in the kitchen with that same careful smile she used when she wanted something to sound harmless. Daniel agreed before I even responded. That's a good idea, he said quickly. We should clear the air. Clear the air. Those words felt rehearsed, like something they had discussed before bringing it to me. I stood there quietly, drying my hands on a kitchen towel while watching Rachel circle a date on the calendar hanging near the refrigerator. Not asking. Marking. Planning. It'll be easier if everyone understands the situation, she added. Everyone. Not just us. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about solving a problem. It was about building pressure. By the time evening arrived, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. Rachel moved through the kitchen with confidence, setting plates along the dining table like she was hosting guests in her own home. Extra chairs appeared from the basement. Extra glasses lined the counter. She directed Daniel to move dishes from one place to another, adjusting everything until the table looked larger than usual. Too prepared. Too organized. Like she had imagined this moment long before I knew it was coming. I stood near the doorway, watching quietly, feeling something different this time. Not fear. Not confusion. Stillness. Because the folder I had prepared sat hidden beside my chair, waiting. The first knock at the door echoed through the house just after 6. Daniel's cousin stepped inside first, smiling politely, followed by his aunt carrying a dessert dish wrapped in foil. I hadn't expected them. No one had told me they were coming. Rachel greeted them warmly, her voice soft and welcoming, her posture relaxed. Thank you for coming, she said, hugging them like this was a family reunion. Not a discussion. Not a confrontation. A performance. The room filled slowly with conversation, the sound of small talk bouncing off the walls. Weather. Work. Memories from years ago, safe topics meant to soften the atmosphere. But beneath the laughter, tension stretched tight. Rachel smiled constantly, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, nodding at stories she had already heard before. Daniel avoided looking directly at me. Keeping his attention fixed on the guests like eye contact might force him to acknowledge what was about to happen. Dinner began quietly. Forks touched plates. Glasses clinked softly. Voices stayed polite. Careful. Measured. Then Rachel began telling her story. I've had a rough time lately, she said gently, her voice soft enough to draw sympathy without sounding dramatic. Everyone listened. She spoke about job struggles, unexpected bills, and people who had let her down. She didn't lie outright. She didn't need to. She simply left out the parts that mattered. Every few seconds, her eyes flicked toward me, watching, measuring, calculating. I never expected to need this much help, she added, lowering her voice slightly. Her glance toward me wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. The room shifted quietly as sympathy settled around the table like dust. Then, halfway through the meal, Rachel placed her napkin down and cleared her throat. The sound cut through the conversation like a sharp blade. I think it's time we talk about responsibility, she said. Silence followed immediately. All movement stopped. She reached beside her chair and pulled out a stack of printed papers, the same kind I had seen before. Bills, charges, late notices, one by one. She laid them across the table where everyone could see. These are things I can't handle alone, she said, her tone steady, reasonable. Then she looked directly at me. I asked Maggie to help, but she seems reluctant. Reluctant. The word sounded innocent, but it carried blame. I felt every set of eyes shift toward me. Daniel spoke next. She's struggling, he said quietly. We should help her. That word hit harder in front of others. Public agreement. Public betrayal. Daniel's cousin nodded slowly. Well, family should help family, he murmured. His aunt followed with a quiet hum of agreement. She's going through a hard time, she added. Their voices weren't loud. They didn't accuse. They didn't demand. But the expectation hung thick in the air. Rachel slid the bills toward me across the table. The papers scraped softly against the wood. The sound loud in the silence. You're in the best position to help, she said, smiling gently. Her eyes, though, weren't gentle at all. They were cold, confident, certain. For a moment, no one spoke. Everyone waited. Expected. Watched. They thought I would fold. They thought I would apologize. They thought I would accept the burden they had carefully built around me. Instead, I breathed slowly, steadily, not rushing, not reacting, just thinking. Then, without raising my voice, I reached beside my chair. The folder rested exactly where I had placed it earlier. Hidden. Ready? Prepared. I pulled it out slowly and set it on my lap, feeling the weight of the documents inside pressing against my hands. No one noticed at first. Rachel kept talking softly, reinforcing her story, repeating words like responsibility and family, as if repeating them often enough would turn them into truth. Then I lifted the folder and placed it gently in the center of the table. The sound of paper touching wood was quiet, but it cut through the room like a sudden crack of thunder. Conversation stopped instantly. Rachel's smile faded just enough for me to see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Daniel noticed it too. His expression shifted from confidence to confusion. Every set of eyes moved toward the folder now, waiting, watching, wondering. And as the silence deepened around that table, thick and unbroken, something inside me settled into place with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since Rachel walked through my front door, I wasn't the one on defense anymore. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd had in the past 35 days. The folder sat in the center of the table like something alive, drawing every eye toward it. No one reached for their forks. No one spoke. Even the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room seemed louder than usual. Rachel stared at the folder, her smile fading inch by inch. What is that? She asked. Her voice wasn't steady anymore. There was a crack in it now, small but impossible to ignore. I placed my hand on top of the folder, not opening it yet, just resting my palm against the surface, feeling the weight of every document inside. For weeks, I had felt pushed into corners inside my own home. Tonight, for the first time, I felt grounded, calm, still, in control. I looked around the table slowly, meeting each pair of eyes before finally settling on Rachel. Then I spoke. If one more account is tied to this address, I will report it as intentional financial fraud under your name. The words left my mouth evenly, without anger, without raised volume, but they landed like thunder. Rachel's eyes widened instantly. Her shoulders stiffened, her posture collapsing inward like air had been pulled from her lungs. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no words followed. His cousin leaned back in his chair, eyebrows lifting in quiet shock. No one moved. No one breathed. That was the moment everything froze. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the folder. Paper slid against paper as I lifted the top document and placed it flat on the table. Then another, and another. Each page carried dates, account numbers, official notices, and copies of envelopes stamped with my address, mail confirmations, address verification forms, balance transfer records. Everything she thought I hadn't noticed. Everything she thought I wouldn't understand. I documented every notice sent to this house, I said quietly. Every account connected to this address. Every change made after you moved in. Rachel swallowed hard, her fingers tightening against the edge of the table. You're overreacting, she said weakly. But the confidence she once carried was gone. Gone completely. I also spoke to a legal advisor, I continued. That sentence struck harder than anything else. Daniel stiffened beside her. "You talked to a lawyer?" he asked. His voice carried confusion now. Unease. Something close to fear. I nodded once. I asked what happens when someone registers accounts under another person's address without permission, I said calmly. And I asked what happens when financial liability begins attaching itself to property records. The room stayed silent. No interruptions. No objections. Just listening. I slid another paper forward until it rested directly in front of Rachel. If any additional accounts appear under this address, I continued, it becomes a documented fraud case. Rachel stared at the paper without touching it. And that responsibility, I added quietly, will be yours alone. For the first time since she arrived, Rachel didn't have a response. Not an excuse. Not an argument. Not even anger. Just silence. The power in the room shifted so sharply it felt physical. Earlier that night, she had pushed bills toward me. Now, I pushed proof toward her. Same table. Different control. Daniel leaned forward slightly. His voice softer now. "You're serious," he said. Not disbelief. Realization. Yes, I replied. I turned my attention back to Rachel. "You have 30 days to change your mailing address," I said steadily. 30 days to resolve every account tied to this property. The words came out clear and firm. No hesitation. No apology. After that, I continued. If anything else arrives here under your name, I will move forward legally. Rachel finally spoke again, but her voice sounded smaller than before. "You wouldn't do that," she whispered. I met her gaze without blinking. "Yes," I said simply. "I would." The truth settled across the table like dust. Heavy. Final. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together slowly as if trying to process everything at once. His cousin and aunt exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence replaced by discomfort. No one defended Rachel now. No one spoke about family responsibility. Not anymore. The dinner ended quietly after that. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Plates remained half full. Conversations faded into silence as guests gathered their belongings and left without meeting my eyes. Rachel didn't say another word as she walked down the hallway. Her steps sounded slower than usual, heavier. Like each one carried weight she could no longer shift onto someone else. Daniel stayed behind in the dining room, staring at the stack of papers still spread across the table. The house felt different once the door closed behind the last guest. Not tense, not crowded, just quiet. Still, I remained standing near the table, running my fingers lightly across the surface where the documents had rested. For weeks, this room had felt unfamiliar, like territory slowly slipping away from me. Now it felt mine again, not because I fought loudly, but because I stood firmly. Later that night, after Rachel retreated to the guest room and Daniel disappeared into the living room, I stood alone in the kitchen where everything had begun. Same sink, same counter, same quiet hum of appliances filling the space. But the air felt lighter, clearer. For the first time in weeks, I breathed without tension pressing against my chest. Helping someone, I realized, should never mean sacrificing yourself. Kindness was never meant to become surrender. And family should never mean losing control of the life you worked decades to build. I rested my hands against the kitchen counter and stared at the familiar walls around me, feeling a quiet strength settle into my bones. Protecting yourself didn't make you selfish. It made you strong. And if there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're survival. If you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to make you feel guilty for protecting what you worked hard to build, I'd truly like to hear your story. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have spoken up sooner? Or waited until the truth was impossible to ignore? And if stories like this remind you that strength doesn't always have to be loud to be powerful, stay with us. Because sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that finally decide they've had enough and refuse to stay silent ever again.